I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, Assistant Professor, Center for Foreign Languages, Central University of Bihar. Today I am going to deliver a talk on Plato and literature. Though Plato never set out to formulate a theory of poetry, he is considered to be the fountainhead of literary criticism. Fountainhead of literary criticism in the sense that he was the first person to raise certain fundamental questions and issues about the nature and function of literature. Plato discussed poetry in the course of conversation for dialogues with his friends and people. In fact, Plato discusses poetry in relation to its broader political, educational, ethical, and philosophical concerns. So, one thing is clear that Plato does not discuss poetry or literature as literature or poetry itself. He always discusses poetry and literature in context of several other disciplines. In fact, Plato's conception of poetry is a part of his political agenda. Plato conceived of an ideal state, and to run that ideal state, he needed certain guardians. These guardians will act as the administrators and the rulers of that ideal state. So, therefore, Plato conceived of a system of education for those guardians. He was of the view that these guardians must be educated in the best possible way. These guardians will make an elite educated class comprising of the best, the wisest, and the most virtuous. In this way, he prepared a curriculum of education for them, and in that hierarchy, he places poetry or music or literature in the very beginning. So, we can see in this hierarchy that Plato has a very low estimate of poetry. Of course, the hierarchy begins with first of all music, poetry, or fables. He was of the view that in the beginning, these guardians will be bodily too weak to evolve any kind of spiritual harmony or physical harmony in their soul. So, their education must begin with the education of poetry or music. It was required for the temperaments of the soul of the young guardians. The second in hierarchy is gymnastics. By training of gymnastics, Plato wanted those guardians to evolve rhythm and harmony through physical training. So, in this training, they will be subjected to very tough exercises. They will be asked to take coarse food, and in this way, they would evolve as athletic and physically strong young youths. Then, third in the hierarchy are intellectual studies, which comprises of maths, geometry, astronomy, and other disciplines. The fourth step will be of intercommunion and connection of the sciences, and the final stage will be of philosophical training. Therefore, we find that in this whole hierarchy, poetry or literature has a very minimal and preliminary role in educating the guardians. In other works of Plato, we can find that his attitude towards poetry was that of denigration. For example, in Plato's Ion and the Republic, particularly in book 2, 3, and 10, we find that Plato expresses his dismissal of poetry. In fact, Plato's rejection of poetry as an element for his ideal state can be understood in the following ways. We can say that Plato dismisses poetry on the following four grounds. First is philosophical ground. Plato, on philosophical ground, Plato calls poetry an act of imitation, and poets are imitators who imitate the world of phenomena, which is itself a shadow of the transcendental and ideal world which exists in heaven. So, Plato was of the view that the world which we live in is only a shadow of that transcendental real world which is considered to be the absolute reality. So, this world is only a copy of that world. What these poets do, these poets in their works of art, in their pieces of literature, only imitate that shadow, and in this way they are twice removed from the truth or real. So, on this ground, Plato rejected poetry as any source of cognition. Second, formal ground. In fact, Plato was the first person to categorize literature into three categories. First is narrative, in which we can keep epics. The second is lyric, in which we can keep compositions of music or song by individual writers. And third is dramatic, which involves the technique of representation. So, Plato highly distrusted this technique of representation, and he was very critical of this technique of dramatic representation. Plato was of the view that an actor on the stage assumes various roles which he does not know in his real life. So, therefore, in this way they give a fake representation of life. They pretend to be what they are not. For example, an actor may assume the role of king, and the very next time he may assume the role of a beggar. And Plato was of the view that that actor in fact does not know anything about the life of a king or the life of a beggar. In this way, these actors are fake people, and therefore dramatic representation was totally discarded by Plato. Further, he said that this dramatic representation does not appeal to the rational and the logical senses of the audience. The next ground is the theological ground. Plato found that in literature, these poets often attribute human qualities to gods and goddesses. They are often represented as greedy, lusty, lecherous, and belligerent human beings. In this way, these gods and goddesses do not offer any ideal picture which could be imitated by human beings. So, therefore, literature is likely to be rejected by Plato. On moral ground too, he rejects literature. He says that these poets often present a bleak and desperate picture of human life, which may discourage human beings from leading a brave life. In fact, Plato wanted his guardians to be very powerful and strong people, but literature has, he perceived that an effeminate effect on human beings. It may make those guardians women-like. Therefore, he distrusted literature on the moral ground too. So, to conclude, we can say Plato finds literature practically futile and devoid of any sense of morality. He also depreciates the power of literature to move and charm the soul of human beings, and thereby he effects a wholesale condemnation of imaginative literature. Thank you.